Your next test is going to be over chapter 23, 24, and 25. So, right now, we're going to review the respiratory system, which is chapter 23. The respiratory system's main functions are ventilation and gas exchange, which is just a fancy way of saying breathing and getting oxygen to our body. The other function of the respiratory system, the more specific functions, include providing a surface area for gas exchange, moving air, protecting respiratory surfaces, production, and detecting odors. This picture is showing you the separation between the two divisions of your respiratory system, the upper respiratory system and the lower respiratory system. It's important that you know what parts of the respiratory system belong to the upper and to the lower. So, in your upper respiratory system, you have your nose, your nasal cavity, and your sinuses. And then the pharynx and the larynx. The larynx is going to act like your dividing line. So, after your larynx, you know that it's going to move on to the lower respiratory system, which includes the trachea, your bronchi, your bronchioles, and the alveoli. Again, another picture showing you what structures belong in each respiratory tract. Your respiratory system can also be organized according to its function. And one function is conduction. Conduction is basically just moving in air into the lungs and air out of the lungs. So it's going to start with your nasal cavity and end with your bronchioles. Where the respiratory portion, its main function is gas exchange, getting that oxygen to our cells and getting rid of that carbon dioxide. So the respiratory portion is going to start at the bronchioles and go down to the alveoli. With the histology of the respiratory system, what you really need to focus on is the lamina propria. So, lamina propria in the upper respiratory tract is going to contain mucus glands, and those mucus glands are going to produce mucus. And it's really important because that mucus is going to play a role in something called the mucus escalator. And what the mucus escalator does is it's your pseudostratified um, ciliated columnar cells, and what they do is with that mucus, it's going to help move that mucus and any debris up so you're able to cough any debris out so it doesn't get down into your lungs and cause any infections or other problems. So let's take a look at the structures in your upper respiratory tract. You have your nose, which obviously is the primary passageway for air to get in and out. It's important that you know that our nostrils are called our nares. Sometimes they're referred to as external nares. We have our nasal cavity. Your nasal cavity is divided by your septum. That's where we're going to find our olfactory region and parts of your nose. We have our sinuses and then our pharynx. And it's important to know about your pharynx that this is the only structure that's shared by your respiratory and digestive tracts. And your pharynx is divided into three sections: your nasopharynx, which is going to be at the end of your nasal cavity, oropharynx, which is at the back of your mouth, and then the laryngopharynx, which is going to go down into your throat. So this picture is just showing you those different regions of the pharynx. You have your nasopharynx, your oro, and then your laryngopharynx, which we think about most of the time as our actual throat. So when we're talking about our larynx, your larynx, its main role is sound production and air conduction. So it's still moving air down into our lungs, but it also plays a role in producing sound because this is where we're going to find our vocal cords. So at your larynx at the top, there's a glottis, and that's the opening of the larynx, and it's going to be surrounded by our vocal folds or our vocal cords. It's where you find your voice box. A lot of people get the glottis and the epiglottis confused. The epiglottis is a flap that is going to close off the top of the glottis when you swallow. So when you swallow, it's going to prevent any liquids or food from going down into your larynx. The epiglottis is also what helps us with our coughing reflex. Your larynx is held in place by your hyoid bone, and like we talked about, it's going to contain our vocal ligaments, which help create our voice. Then we move on to our lower respiratory tract, which is going to include your trachea, which is your windpipe. The main function of your trachea is just transporting air from your larynx to your bronchi, or from your bronchi to your larynx. Your bronchial tree is going to are the branches off of the trachea, which are going to go into the lungs. And there's going to be a right and left main bronchi. And with those right and left main bronchi, an interesting fact is that your right side has a much larger diameter because your left side is where your heart is, so it's a little smaller. But when foreign objects enter into your bronchi, like when you're choking, they usually get stuck on the right side rather than the left. And then we have our lungs. And your lungs, you have a right and a left lung. The right, again, is larger. It has 3 lobes or 3 sections, and the left has 2. Our lungs are found within our pleural cavity. And these are just pictures showing you your trachea. And off of your trachea, you can see the bronchi. And then the bronchi are going to go into the lungs, and that's where we'll find our bronchioles and our alveoli. Again, a picture of your lungs. Your right lung has those 3 lobes, and your left has 2. So there's different regions of our bronchi. Really what you need to know for your test is that your bronchi branches off of your trachea. And off of those bronchi are going to branch the bronchioles. The bronchioles are just carrying air either to or from our bronchi and to or from our alveoli. And alveoli is where gas exchange is actually happening. Alveoli are going to be covered in capillaries, and that's where our cells are able to get oxygen from our bloodstream and where our bloodstream is able to release that carbon dioxide. Again, a picture of our bronchi showing you that it branches off into those bronchioles, ending in the alveoli. Like I said before, your alveoli is covered in capillaries, and there's different cell layers that help with gas diffusion and making surfactant, which is just kind of lubricating the alveoli on the inside of the lungs. And the blood-air barrier is where gas exchange is actually occurring. There's 2 different types of respiration. There's internal respiration and external respiration. External respiration is basically you're taking air into your body, and it's going into like the surrounding fluids, and you're releasing that air as well. So basically, it's just breathing in and breathing out. Where internal respiration is where your body is actually absorbing carbon dioxide into your blood cells and then releasing carbon dioxide. You don't really have to worry about the gas laws and the pressure, but I would know that inspiration is another way to say inhaling, and expiration is another way to say exhale. We know that our pleural cavity works like a vacuum, that when the volume is increased or decreased, that's based on the movement of our diaphragm and our respiratory muscles and our rib cage. And there's different types of breathing, and how we're able to breathe is dependent on things like resistance to airflow and how healthy our lungs are. We did the lab where we measured the different ways that, or I'm sorry, we had that lab where we measured the volume of our lungs by looking at different ways air moves in and out of our lungs. And then don't worry about gas exchange for your test. We looked at different pathologies, and then we ended the respiratory system. So next up, watch your recap over your digestive system and then your urinary system.